and welcome to our writing project, Comparing and Contrasting Different Versions of Cinderella. Today we're going to look at Lesson 3, Defining Compare and Contrast Text Structure. Today, you will identify the purpose and elements of compare and contrast texts. You will organize text in two ways. You will use logical sequencing of information when writing and presenting information, and you will increase comprehension by asking for clarification from the speaker. Remember that in earlier writing lessons, you learned the elements of fairy tales. You read two versions of the Cinderella story, as well as a sonnet, and then compared and contrasted them using a Venn diagram. Writers go through steps like this when they are preparing to write a text that compares and contrasts two things: two texts, two restaurants, or two brands of athletic shoes, for example. They study each object separately and then set them side by side to see how similar they are and how they are different. Then they write about these differences. The main goal in compare and contrast writing is to give information about similarities and differences. Therefore, compare and contrast writing is informational writing. Like other informational text, a compare and contrast text starts with a central idea and then offers evidence, examples, and details to support the central idea. Remember that when writers compare and contrast, they don't just summarize, they analyze. They put things side by side, they look at them closely, and then they draw a conclusion or make a judgment about them. They might say that one pair of jeans is a better deal than the other, one story is a better example of a fairy tale than the other, or one movie is more entertaining than the other. Remember that good compare and contrast writing helps readers see both objects in a new light, and that it may even persuade readers of something they didn't agree with before. People in all types of jobs and professions compare and contrast objects, ideas, or people on a daily basis. For example, store managers compare product descriptions to see what brands of merchandise they want to order for their store. Restaurant managers compare and contrast sales receipts to see which night of the week is slow and needs a boost. Sports analysts compare and contrast the latest statistics to see which team or player is better. School advisors compare and contrast colleges that might be good for one student and not so good for another. Compare and contrast is a basic tool not only in professional situations, but also in everyday decision-making situations. For example, before you decide which pair of jeans you want to buy, you probably compare and contrast two or more pairs. You look at their prices, styles, and colors, as well as how they fit you. Before any decision is made, we compare and contrast two or more choices in our minds. We do this so often that we don't even realize we're doing it. In this lesson and in later ones, we will be consciously comparing and contrasting two texts. We will make sure our thinking is clear and our logic is sound. We will put our compare and contrast ideas into writing. This will help us sharpen our critical thinking skills and prepare us for everyday decision making and on-the-job decision making. Informational text can be organized using different structures, such as procedural, sequential or chronological, cause and effect, problem and solution, and compare and contrast. We will now look more closely at the compare and contrast text structure. Compare and contrast texts are usually organized in one of two ways, in block format or in point-by-point format. The format you see here is the block format. Look at the introduction. Just like other informational text, compare and contrast texts begin with an introduction that does three things: hooks the reader's interest, identifies the topic, and states, or at least strongly implies, the central idea or thesis. Everything in the text will relate to and support this central idea. In a compare and contrast text, the central idea is that two things are similar in some ways and different than others. For example, apples and oranges are both good, healthy snacks, but they come in handy in different situations. Later, when you are working on your own compare and contrast text, we'll talk about some of the different forms the thesis statement can take. In the body of a compare and contrast text using block format, the writer tells all about the first thing and then tells all about the second thing. He or she gives blocks of information to describe each of the two things in turn. Usually the information will be parallel. For example, a writer comparing apples and oranges will first tell all about the taste, texture, and best season for apples. Then he or she will tell all about the taste, texture, and best season for oranges. Like other informational text, a compare and contrast text ends with a conclusion that sums up the central idea of the whole text. In the block format, the conclusion should also make a judgment about two things being compared. It should briefly say which is better, preferable, or more valuable, and why. For example, apples and oranges both make great snacks. However, an apple is better when you want to fill your stomach, and an orange is a better choice when you are thirsty. This is the point-by-point format. I want you to look at this format for a second and then look at the block format. You can actually open both of those in today's lesson post in Google Classroom. Notice how they are different. Notice how they are similar. In a compare and contrast text using the point-by-point format, the introduction names the two things being compared and contrasted. It also names several differences between the two things. The body of the text will then describe these differences one by one. For example, apples and oranges are both good, healthy snacks, but apples are more satisfying because they are crunchier, larger, and starchier. In the body of a compare and contrast text using point-by-point format, the writer tells all about the first difference, then all about the second difference, and then all about the third difference. In a text comparing and contrasting rap and classical music, for example, a writer might first discuss the different instruments used. He or she might then discuss the different origins of each type of music. And finally, he or she might discuss the different role of each in modern society. Writers are not limited to three differences, by the way. They can consider as many differences as they find important. The conclusion may include new information, but should always restate the thesis or central idea in strong and memorable language. For example, apples and oranges both make great snacks. However, the properties of an apple allow it to conquer hunger in ways that an orange cannot. Writers choose the format that works best with the points they want to make. Later on, when you're planning your own essays, you will talk about why one format is more appropriate in some cases than the other format in other cases. If one format feels more comfortable to you than the other format, try to remember that. In later writing lessons, you'll be choosing one of the formats to use in your own compare and contrast essays. Now we will go to Nearpod where you will answer a question about these formats. Then I want you to explore the Lesson 2A materials to look at different other versions of the Cinderella fairy tale that you might use in your compare and contrast essay.